shared. Okay. Recording in progress. We got it. Okay. And not really meant to be shared with the uninitiated. And nothing really was what it appeared to be. Our visual perceptions weren't to be trusted in the world of the Da Vinci Code. But next image, please. If we look carefully at Leonardo da Vinci's work, if you look at his notebooks, I'm going to go for the next image. Hopefully it'll, oh, there we go. If you look at his notebooks and his sketches and his completed works and his writings, what's fascinating is just the opposite is really true. The work isn't about, I believe, what is hidden, but I think it's about what is revealed and what is discovered and what is opened to us. Our vision, of course, coupled with our intellect, is to be trusted as the way to kind of discern this kind of wondrous workings of the world in Leonardo's eyes. This image I love, little sketch from Leonardo. It's a wonderful jumble here. I love these peas and this kind of little opening image of peas and cherries and architectural sketches and notes. And this to me seems indicative of this passion for opening and discovery that is really at the center of Leonardo's work. There are almost 7,500 pages of drawings and notes from the notebooks, which have now, of course, all been taken apart, I think reveal an extraordinary gift for patient, objective, and thorough observation. And quite frankly, everything fascinates him. It doesn't matter if it's the veining of a leaf or a pea pod or the tension in a tendon, everything gets his attention. He's always looking and examining and asking and recording. And these notebooks are just, they're really quite extraordinary. And they're such a testament to this attitude, I think, of constant awareness and discovery. These little notebooks he started when he was a young man in Florence, and evidently kept those until his death, never left his side. And they're a jumble, just as this piece we're looking at is. They're studies of motion and weight and water and anatomy and little mathematical puzzles and perspective drawings and little notes to himself, which I love. There's little notes saying, make sure to read this book. And here's the budget for my household. And here's how much I spent on hosiery this month. And little aphorisms. One, necessity is the mistress and the guide of nature. And this is my absolute personal favorite. Leonardo da Vinci's to-do lists. This one is one of my favorites. Just a note to himself, get a skull nut mustard. Skull nut mustard. Love that. And another to-do list, make glasses in order to see moon large. We love it. Next image, please. One writer has observed, and this is an image of a deluge, that Leonardo was aware of movement in a way that it was quite unique in his time in the early 16th century. If you look at the words he uses in the notebooks, they're just filled with motion and very forceful verbs. He writes about rising and falling and expanding and revolving and dragging and flowing and ebbing and pouring and penetrating. And I think this is just the perfect metaphor for his mind. It is in constant motion as well. And again, you've got this keen eye and a determined intellect that sees everything, that investigates everything. Again, from the veins in a leaf to the surface of the moon. He was, as you know, a painter, an inventor, an engineer, a philosopher, a scientist. Evidently, this is something, maybe this is new to you, a musician. Apparently, he had a very good voice, and he was an athlete, apparently a very fine equestrian. He studied, just to name a few areas, botany, geology, zoology, hydraulics, military science, engineering, animal lore, anatomy, and physical science. His art and his experimentation and his curiosity really didn't have any boundaries. Next image, please. He's a son of kind of a shrewd and energetic notary who I think early on saw the gifts of his son. This is a self-portrait of Leonardo. And he apprenticed him at age 14 to a very, very well-known artist of the day, Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio was an architect, a painter, and sculptor. And if you had an apprenticeship like this, you would have learned to do everything. The studio was a busy and challenging place. One week we might be working on a candelabra, the next week a relief, the next week an altarpiece, a religious painting. The training was broad, and the key was versatility in all areas. So in this apprenticeship, Leonardo would have learned, everything: how to make his varnish or grind colors, how to use a sculptor's tools, how to prepare, sketch from a live model, or prepare drapery with wet rags soaked in plaster. This was, again, a kind of a broad and wide-ranging education. He spent 6 years with his master, and soon, of course, he was ready to go out on his own, which he did at age 20. Next image, please. At that point, for the rest of his life, he was open to every kind of commission and project you can imagine. And he did everything. Caricatures like this one. He did commissioned portraits. You might have asked him to create costumes or stage sets. Next image, please. Anatomy studies. We're going to go. The next image is, I think, coming up here, the skull. Anything was fair game. And he was even asked at one point in his career to do something, again, we might particularly perhaps associate with plumbing. He was asked to devise a heating system for a duchess's bath. So anything and everything was fair game in his career. Next image, please. One of his very, very first works, this is unfinished, is an image of Saint Jerome. And this is, again, in the Vatican Gallery. Early on, this was actually cut in two and then later rejoined in the 19th century. And what we're looking at here is Saint Jerome beating his breast with a stone in a kind of a penitential passion. He is bald and beardless and quite alone, save the lion at his feet, who seems to howl in a kind of shared suffering with Jerome. You look at the body, it's fascinating, kind of an emaciated body, a complexity of movement, and look at the lines. Look at the lines extending downward from his tilted face, Jerome's face. Look at the lines coming up from his leg, and then look at the line coming over from his hand, all of them converging on his chest, and that kind of point of the stone's impact, which is really interesting. Leonardo loved this background and history of St. Jerome and did several versions, several works that focused on this saint. Of course, was the one who translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Latin and was passionate about classical literature of Greece and Rome and the classical world, as was Leonardo. Next image, please. Leonardo called himself a disciple of experiment, which is an interesting phrase, and had such a thirst for knowledge. This is an early portrait of his, that it really didn't allow much time to complete anything. And you'll see that's a kind of a continuing theme in his life. He lives 67 years, which I would consider a pretty good long life, not today, but certainly in the Renaissance. But during that time, we've got, well, not a lot. You've got not an entire statue, but lots and lots of sketches for statues and monuments, but no completed statue. We've got lots and lots of architectural drawings and plans, but not a building. No building did he ever actually create. We've got about a dozen finished paintings, and this is one of them. Some very, very fine anatomical and mechanical sketches, but there's no great book on anatomy. But what you do have is thousands of sketches and notes and ideas. And that really is, in many ways, the legacy. Next image. There's so many areas that claimed his attention that it was obviously very hard to complete projects. There were endless anatomy studies. And I think many of you know that, of course, he actually participated in 30 dissections of human cadavers. But again, this didn't result in a definitive book on anatomy. Next image. He was utterly fascinated with animals, animal lore, and observations of animals. I love this little crab. But again, there was no animal text, but such a sensitive eye to looking at animals and at nature. Next image, I bet, is one you've never seen. Look at this. Just such simplicity in working in red chalk. These trees, this little stand of trees is really quite extraordinary. Next image, please. In addition to wildly imaginative inventions, many of which in many ways anticipate the 20th century, he had precursors of today, something like a parachute, a helicopter, a mechanical excavator, machine guns, things like that, life preservers, a machine for minting coins. He also had sketches for what he thought would be an ideal city, where vehicles would be on one level and pedestrians on another. And although he himself was a pacifist and considered, for his words, a bestial madness, he had these military inventions. This is actually an image of a cannon foundry, but he had ideas for things like gigantic ballistas or scythed chariots or multi-barreled cannons. So this is all part of the kind of, I don't know, fascinating mind at work that could kind of develop ideas in all these different areas. Again, hard to even imagine. Next image, please. Leonardo was, as you can see, a brilliant draftsman. And I think sometimes we lose that idea in this fascination, again, with the notebooks and with the inventions and the ideas and all these things he's jotted down. But if you just look at the artwork alone, you can hardly believe, again, the drawing skills. He did countless preliminary sketches and drawings for everything that he actually did complete, of those few things he did. And you'll see him using every technique that was known during the Renaissance, and also kind of developing things that you think, well, nobody seemed to have ever done that before. Again, when I showed you the trees a minute ago, he worked in kind of a fine, sharpened red chalk, which he seemed to be one of the very first people to do this. But his favorite medium, and I'm going to show you the next one, please.
On the PT page, yourclassical.org.
All right. So the next one, again, his favorite medium was pen.
Remember.
Okay. And I think we're going to want to mute. If you're not muted, you're going to want to mute. Okay, perfect. Perfect. So again, that favorite medium was pen and ink. And that allowed him, that this is amazing, he could actually draw and then turn without interruption from the drawing to the written commentary. So this was perfect because he wouldn't have to take the time to actually stop and pick up another tool. So some efficiency there. You'll see here, I love this image, the study of hands. Very, very gifted, of course, in his draftsmanship and his skills with drawing the body, anatomy. Fascinating, though, is always look at the hands. They're eloquent and they're so moving. And I think you'll see the few works that do exist by Leonardo, hands and gestures loaded with meaning and symbolism are often at the heart of the compositions. Next image, please. This is the Virgin of the Rocks. There are two versions of this that exist. This one is the National Gallery of Art. And this is fascinating. I want you to look kind of closely at this piece here, because in many ways it combines twin worlds that we've seen fill those notebooks, right? There is the world of scientific naturalism, and there is the world in which he has very carefully studied anatomy and the human form. There is also another world that is so apparent here, and that is the world of imagination. If you look at it, it's this funny combination of the plant life is accurate, but the setting is like something out of a sci-fi novel. It's this eerie, watery cave and strange kind of geological formations, and you think, well, where in the world is this? So again, somehow that combination of observed reality and imagination seems to be at the center of this image of the Virgin. Again, I just mentioned hands. Look here at hands. Hands are, again, this is a little dark, but hands are protecting, they're blessing, and they're worshiping. And again, you'll see in some of the other pieces that we look at that the hands and the gestures often link the figures and the narrative. All that Leonardo learned, I think, is right here too. The idea of the aerial perspective, that big pyramidal formation or composition. Often when we're looking at Leonardo's work, we are looking at a big pyramid or a triangle. Same thing here, where the Virgin's head is the top of that triangle. And then we kind of go down from there with, again, the Christ child, John, and the angel. Idealized beauty, perfect modeling, and again, a really impressive handling of the drapery as well, but are all elements of this piece. Next image, please. It's another Virgin and Child theme. This one is a big cartoon or a study that actually lives at the National Gallery of Art in London in its own little dark chamber because it's quite fragile. He worked on, I mentioned with St. Jerome a minute ago, that if he got a theme that he liked, he would stick with that theme. And here he worked on this theme of Virgin and Child on and off for about 15 years. But again, didn't have many completed works, but he kept playing with it and studying it. Originally, this was a commission that came from an order of monks. And what would have been done, he would have said, this is my idea. Here's a cartoon. Here's a sketch. Here's a plan for it. What do you think of this? So this would have been the plan for that commission. The commission never, ever appeared and never came to fruition. All that exists is this, again, this cartoon of the Virgin and her mother and John and Christ. The drawing was made around 1499. And again, probably shown to the monks who were very excited for what they were going to get. Little did they know, they never got it at all. But this is all that exists. What might strike you as a little peculiar when you look at this is the composition. And I want you to look at this for just a second and kind of look at how very, very unusual this is. What we're looking at here is two grown women, and of course, an infant and a young child. But what we're looking at is one grown woman is actually sitting on another grown woman's lap. And you think, well, this is a rather unusual composition. Mother and daughter both look quite young, but somehow he's able to kind of pose them in a balance of weight and mass, and also again, give them a kind of a grandeur and a balance. Rather unusual. He also gives them this kind of almost like a monumental feel. The figures look like they're right off a classical pediment. But it's a very intriguing composition. What binds them together, of course, is the infant Christ child and St. John. Like so many of the projects, and the one we just looked at, it's never completed. But I want you to look a little bit carefully too, again, at those hands and at the way our eye moves around the composition. We go from the mother's gaze, from Anne to Mary. We look and follow Mary's arm down and around and up through the Christ child and the hand and the gesture. So it's this amazing kind of circular motion within a pyramid, which is really intriguing. Next image, please. Whatever we may think today of Machiavelli, he apparently was a good friend to Leonardo and used his position in the Florentine government to try to get Leonardo da Vinci commissions. And this was one of those commissions, which again, never came to anything. And it's a commission for the Battle of Anghiari. Sadly, again, didn't materialize, but as with many of Leonardo's projects, there are studies, there are cartoons, there are plans. It's just that the piece did not happen. Here, this is really fascinating. It's a big kind of a tangle of a violent tangle of men and horses warriors kind of slashing and animals kicking and biting. And it seems just kind of a horrific and timeless image of violence and of war. All lines seem to converge right in the center. And it's hard even to imagine how we pull apart the bodies of both the men and the horses in this image. Next image, please. And this is another study for that very same piece. And again, what they got was a cartoon, a study, but nothing ever came of it. Michelangelo also did a cartoon or a study for this very same project. And again, it didn't materialize either. There was a sense, maybe I would call it a competition in spirit, if not in fact, between Leonardo and Michelangelo, who were certainly aware of each other. And for this commission, they both chose the subjects in which they excelled. So for Michelangelo, he would have always picked the male nude, and Leonardo picked horses. So it kind of an intriguing idea. But again, they were quite well known to each other. Next image, please. After that commission fizzled, one of many that are fizzling. This is Leonardo's sketch of Michelangelo's David. Leonardo received another kind of an honor with a bit of an ironic twist. He was asked to serve on a committee to decide where in Florence Michelangelo's David was going to be placed, which is kind of funny and intriguing. And obviously he did it. I guess he stifled his feelings and served on that committee. But there's a pointed section in a piece that he wrote called Comparison of the Arts that I think, I'm guessing, is directed at Michelangelo. So this is, again, Leonardo writing. He said, I do not find any difference between painting and sculpture, except this. He said, the sculptor pursues his work with greater physical effort, and the painter pursues his with greater mental effort. Sculpture, again, always pointing at Michelangelo, demands a wholly mechanical exercise that is often accompanied by much sweat and combines with the dust and turns into a crust of dirt. His face is covered with this paste and powdered with marble dust like a baker, and he's covered with tiny chips as if it had snowed on him. His lodgings are dirty and filled with stone splinters and dust. Again, now, in contrast, the painter, again, meaning Leonardo, he writes again, in the case of the painter, just the opposite occurs. He sits with great ease in front of his work, well-dressed, moving a light brush with agreeable colors. He is adorned with such garments as he pleases, and his dwelling is clean and filled with beautiful paintings. He often has himself accompanied with music or the sound of different beautiful works being read, which he may hear with great pleasure, undisturbed by the pounding of hammers or other noises. I love this. I believe there was a rivalry, perhaps a slightly unfriendly rivalry between the two. Next image, please. One of Leonardo's, of course, most important and iconic works is obviously The Last Supper, which is thought to be the first great figure composition of the High Renaissance. It was begun in 1495 at the request of Lodovico Sforza. And of course, it was placed on the wall, the dining hall wall in a Dominican monastery of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan. Nothing new here. Again, this topic has been painted for about 1,000 years when Leonardo tackles it. What's interesting, the subject is not new, but the way he does it is a little bit unusual. The two big problems that artists always thought about when they were painting Last Supper were these. The first, what in the world do you do with 13 men at this straight table? How do you arrange the composition? And the second and most important is how in the world do you make clear the identity of Judas at a glance? Traditionally, at least for about the first 1,000 years, the solution was, well, easy. I put Judas on one side of the table by himself. Then you understand what's happening. Leonardo does something really different, though, and we'll explore that in depth here. Next image. Leonardo had been developing his ideas for the Last Supper again, we talked about this with the virgin and child, for 15 years, many, many studies and many sketches. With the exception of Jesus, all of the figures in that composition are drawn from real people. Next image, please, that Leonardo sought out in and near Milan. And to locate an appropriate Judas, or so the story goes, Leonardo spent so much time wandering through the haunts of Milanese criminals that the prior at the monastery complained to the one commissioning, to the Duke commissioning, that he was just lazy. To this, and this is a good story if this is true, Leonardo replied that he was indeed having difficulty finding a Judas, but if pressed, he could use the head of the prior, which would do very nicely. I love that story. Next image, please. And there's, of course, the head of Judas. We're going to go to the next image and see if we can get the whole thing back. All right. You know what? I think we'll go back to the entire thing. Maybe we'll go backwards a couple, just so we can just see that. One more back. There we go. Any accusation of laziness was absolutely comical. A contemporary account said that he would come to the convent at early dawn, get on that scaffolding and work until he had no light, never thinking of food at all. The quote goes, but he was utterly absorbed in his work. And in addition, again, to using live models, and this is something I want you to look at carefully on the table, he surrounded the figures with objects that would have been in everyday use in the monastery in the 1490s. So in the piece was the china, the forks, all of the things that the monks would have been dining on at that time are depicted in this Last Supper. So the concept was really that Christ was a kind of spiritual prior, eating the food that was being eaten right there at that time in that monastery. So the effect must have been quite extraordinary to see this at the time it was painted and look down and realize, well, that's the same plate I'm using for dinner. So that idea of the extension of the world of the monastery into that image must have been really fascinating and powerful at the time that it was created. Now, breaking with the past, what Leonardo does here is so fascinating is that, again, he puts Judas on the very same side of the table as everybody else, but he cuts him off in different ways. He isolates and identifies him for the viewer in different ways, really using a much more psychological approach. And again, if we look at Judas, again, who is in blue, pulling back from the group with his hand, again, on the bag of coins, he isolates Judas, again, psychologically, which is, I think, far more powerful and striking than just saying he is the one guy on the other side of the table from everyone else. Judas is kind of dark and staring and leaning away from Christ and sealed in guilt and solitude. If you look at everyone else, everybody else is abuzz. Christ is the kind of calm center of this storm, having just announced that one at the table will betray me. He is right at the center, and again, geometrically kind of framed with this little almost architectural halo above his head. But look at the figures on either side. They're all abuzz. They're filled with questions and denial, and they're emoting and they're fearful. And most importantly, the other disciples are communicating with each other. If you look at it, Christ is not, Judas is not talking to anybody else, but everybody else is sharing the kind of shock and their kind of emotional response to this pronouncement from Christ. And they're linked, I think, by those emotions. The viewer, I think, sees at once this whole story in a way that he never did before. The disciples at each end kind of bookend this whole very, very intense set of movements in the center of it. And Cheryl, sorry to make you go back and forth, but I thought it was better to see the whole thing. Okay, now we're going to go forward again. Okay, and forward again. All right. Yeah, and one more time. All right. The whole arrangement, when you think about it, has a lot of Leonardo's mathematics in it. At the center again, always the pyramid at the center is Christ forming that triangle. The vanishing point is behind his head, and the little pediment making kind of a little architectural halo. And if you look at it, the disciples are in 2 groups of 6, further broken down into 4 groups of 3. And again, you've got this inner drama, but this geometrical kind of structure as well, and all linked with this idea of action and reaction. Everybody is reacting to what Christ has just said. And I love the fact you can see in this perfect little drawing here, this pyramid that is Christ. And again, if you look at the disciples on either side, you'll see again the repetition on each side of 3 of these pyramidal forms. So again, yeah, great exercise in geometry. Next image, please. All right, so protecting this and conserving it almost since day one has been a challenge and a kind of a nightmare. This piece was not a fresco, but it was done in tempera. And so to do this, what Leonardo had to do was cover a stone wall, not with plaster and paint on the plaster as a fresco would be, but with a kind of an experimental mixture of pitch and mastic. And, you know, experiments, never a good idea. Another big issue was that when he was doing this piece, the walls had been kind of rebuilt. And they had a kind of a moisture retaining rubble mix that had acids and salts almost from day one. There were issues with moisture and mold. So by 1556, and this was just, 60 years after he's painted it, Vasari, the art historian Vasari, is looking at this and thinking there's nothing visible, in his words, except a muddle of blots. All kinds of attempts were made to clean it. And again, the biggest attempt, and I think I've got an image, maybe the next one, I hope, of the cleaning. Oh, no. All right, let's stay on the cleaning. All right. The biggest one was 1980 to 89, so almost 10 years. And what was done here was conservators went inch by inch over the composition with scalpels and tweezers and solvent and microscopic magnifying lens, and they found the original piece in many ways. So they were trying to remove layers and layers of what was added. So they actually went inch by inch, literally trimming beards and rearranging hands and resetting the table. And in the process, they're finding all kinds of things. They're finding a slice of lemon on a plate, or the rims on the dishes, or the loaf of broken bread, or even the fact that the dishes reflected the colors of the disciples' robes. So kind of an extraordinary experience, again, 10 years. And I think there's an airlock. Many of you have probably visited there recently, but I think there's an airlock now that protects the piece as well. So now we're going to the next image, to a few more just to wrap up. So just in many ways, like the Last Suppers, conservators, I think at best we can piece together fragments, somewhat enigmatic fragments, somewhat distorted really, of Leonardo da Vinci and his life and his work. He remains, I think for many, a very, very complex puzzle. You know, here's somebody who's not a physician, but devotes so much time and understanding to human anatomy. Here's somebody who's a pacifist who designs these machines of war. Next image, please. Here's somebody with so many, many ideas that very few of them ever come to fruition. This is Neptune with the seahorses. Here's somebody, next image, who's a brilliant draftsman, an incredibly sensitive artist in terms of capturing portraits, but who actually does very, very, very few portraits in his life. Next image, please. It's all about, when I think about it, the key words are discovery and opening and exploration. Next image, please. Those are the words that I think define Leonardo and his work and his life. He is always introducing us to new worlds. Next image, please. With every image and every page of his notebook. Next image. He's guiding us into new realms and realms we never could have imagined exploring. He is always going to be, I think, a guide to us for an area of worlds that just create eternal fascination. If we, like Leonardo, continue to look at the world and each other with attention and care, and with both an artist and a scientist's eye, we will continue to discover amazing things through this artist's work, and again, through our own eyes as well. Thank you so much today for joining me on this very hot August afternoon. And I am happy to try to, I don't know if I can field any questions, but I'll try.
And just so you know, everyone's muted, so you'll need to unmute yourself.
Okay, unmute if you've got a question. I am guessing there are many people here who have traveled and seen many of these things in person, and maybe even have seen lately, I don't know, post-conservation Last Supper, I bet. Anybody share any recent travels? Pre-pandemic travels?